Hello friends and welcome again to the Statisticians. In this lesson, we will learn about the type of errors that can be made in hypothesis testing. In general, we can have two types of errors, type 1 error and type 2 error. First we will define the types of errors and then we will see some interesting examples to identify these errors. Type 1 error is when you reject a true null hypothesis and is the more serious error. It is also called a false positive. The probability of making this error is alpha, the level of significance. Since the researcher choose the alpha, the responsibility of making this error lies entirely on researcher. Type 2 error is when you accept a false null hypothesis. The probability of making this error is denoted by beta. Beta depends on mainly two things, sample size and population variance. So if your topic is difficult to test due to the hard sampling or has high variability, it is more likely to make this type of error. As you can imagine, if this kind of problem arises, it is not your fault. So type 2 error is considered as a smaller problem. Here it is important to mention that the probability of rejecting a false null hypothesis is equal to 1 minus beta. This is the researcher's goal, to reject a false null hypothesis. Therefore, 1 minus beta is called the power of the test. Generally, researchers increase the power of the test by increasing the sample size. This is the common table which usually statisticians use to summarize the types of errors. You don't really want to make any of the two errors, but it happens sometimes. We are going to look at a little chart here. Across the top there's some truth about the population and we don't know what that truth is. But it's either the null hypothesis is true or the null hypothesis is false. On the other side, we are going to take a sample and we are going to make a decision about the population based on the sample information. Then our decision is one of two things here. Either we fail to reject the null hypothesis or we reject the null hypothesis. Let's take a look at this situation right up here. If the null hypothesis is true and we fail to reject the null hypothesis, what type of decision was made? Well, it is a correct decision. Because the null hypothesis is true, we fail to reject it. So that's a perfect thing. Now let's take a look at this situation down here. If the null hypothesis is false and we reject the null hypothesis, again we have made the correct decision. That's great. Let's look at this situation. Now consider if the null hypothesis is true and we reject it. We have made an incorrect decision. The null hypothesis was true, but we rejected it. Saying that it was false, we have made an error. Let's see what type of error this is. So we rejected the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis was actually true. That's called a type 1 error. Reject the null hypothesis when in fact the null hypothesis is true is called a type 1 error. Now let's look at this final situation here. The null hypothesis is false. We should reject it. But what happened? We failed to reject it. So again we have made an error. What type of error that is? That when you fail to reject the null hypothesis when actually the null hypothesis is false, that's called a type 2 error. Fail to reject the null hypothesis when in fact the null hypothesis is false. These are all the possibilities or possible outcomes that can happen in hypothesis test. In two cases, we make the correct decision, and in other two cases, we make an incorrect decision. One of them is a type 1 error, and the other one is called a type 2 error. Let's look at a couple of examples. Here is an example involving a criminal trial. So somewhere out here is the truth about the defendant. Either the defendant did not commit the crime or the defendant did commit the crime. As a jury, we don't really know the correct answer to that. Over here, jury is going to make a verdict based on the evidence presented, either not guilty or guilty. If the defendant did not commit the crime and the jury finds the defendant not guilty, that was the correct verdict. If the defendant did commit the crime and the jury finds the defendant guilty, again that's the correct verdict. What about right here? If the defendant did not commit the crime but was found guilty, then that would mean that the defendant was wrongly convicted, and that's called a type 1 error. And our last one here, if the defendant did commit the crime but was found to be not guilty, there was not enough evidence to convict, then the defendant was wrongly cleared, and that's a type 2 error. Look at one more example here, where we would be testing for a disease. So somewhere up here, there is a truth about the patient. Either the patient does not have the disease or the patient does have the disease. Then we take a blood test, let's say, and we get some test results. The results are either negative, saying that the patient doesn't have the disease, or a positive test result saying that patient does have the disease. Let's look at over 4 cases again. Right here the patient does not have the disease and gets a negative test result. That's the correct results. That's great. Right down here the patient does have the disease. We sure they get a positive test result, then that would be the correct result. What about down here? The patient doesn't have the disease, but yet the lab results come back positive, saying that the patient does have. That would be what we call a false positive, and that's a type 1 error. Right up here, the patient does have the disease but gets a negative test results. We call that a false negative, and that's a type 2 error. You should be aware that statistics is very useful but not perfect. Alright, that's all from our side. If you like our videos, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and click this little bell icon so you don't miss out any new video. Thank you so much for watching our videos.